abandoned, underestimated, forgotten. Clara Evans was never supposed to rise again. But against all odds, she built a new life, a new legacy. And tonight, at her ex's wedding, the truth shatters everything. Witness a powerful journey of survival, justice, and unstoppable strength. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring true stories that remind us. Storms don't break us, they reveal us. The late afternoon light slanted through the narrow windows of my London flat, laying golden ribbons across the worn oak floor. I sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of cold chamomile tea between my hands, staring at the heavy cream envelope lying unopened before me. It had arrived 2 days ago, hand-delivered. No return address, no stamps, just my name written in looping calligraphy. Clara Jean Evans. No Miss Evans. No titles. Just my full name, as if spoken by a voice I hadn't heard in years. I didn't touch it, not at first. Something about it felt like a trap set with delicate care, baited with memories I had buried deep. For hours it sat there, a silent dare, while I busied myself with emails, laundry, anything to avoid the weight of what might be inside. It wasn't until Ethan found me sitting there, motionless in the kitchen, that I realized how much space the unopened letter had taken up in my mind. "Mom," he said, backpack slung over one shoulder, his curly hair falling into his bright, serious eyes. "You're looking at that thing like it owes you money." I laughed, the sound dry and brittle in the stillness. "Maybe it does," I murmured, ruffling his hair as he passed by. But even as I smiled for his sake, my hand trembled slightly when it brushed the envelope. Now, 2 days later, the air was too heavy, the questions too loud. I finally peeled open the seal, my fingers slow, almost reverent, like uncovering a relic from another life. A thick piece of cardstock slid free, embossed with golden letters so formal they practically sneered. "Madeline Elise Hart and David James Cole cordially invite you to their wedding celebration at the Hart Estate, Savannah, Georgia, USA." My stomach tightened. David. I hadn't thought of him in any real way for years, not since the night he packed a suitcase without a word and left me standing barefoot on a cheap linoleum floor, 6 months pregnant and clutching hope like a life preserver. He had been my world once, a boy with soft promises and a future we scribbled together on napkins and diner menus. I believed in him the way young girls believe in summer, certain it will never end. And now, 11 years later, he was marrying her. Madeline Hart, the golden girl of Savannah society. Richer than God, sharper than glass, beautiful in a way that belonged on magazine covers. She had always been there, orbiting David like a fixed star, her family whispering that he was wasting his potential on a girl like me. I still remembered her laughing at a charity ball, pretending not to know I could hear her, asking if I planned to wear those shoes again next Sunday. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing through the sudden rush of old shame. I wasn't naive. I knew why they sent this. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a test. They wanted to see if I would show up, if I would still flinch, still shrink under the weight of what I used to be. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I hadn't been her for a long, long time. That night after dinner, Ethan and I sat on the worn leather couch, watching a nature documentary, something about jaguars stalking prey in the Amazon. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the television and the occasional clink of Ethan's spoon in his ice cream bowl. Without saying anything, I reached over and placed the wedding invitation in his lap. He read it carefully, his brows knitting together. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice caught between disbelief and concern. "Yeah," I said simply. He was quiet for a long time, and then, with a seriousness that made my heart ache, he said, "You should go." I shook my head, almost laughing. "Why in the world would I do that?" "Because," he said, his brown eyes steady and clear, "you're not the woman they remember, and they need to see that." I stared at him, at this boy who had once fit in the crook of my arm, who now stood taller than my shoulder, who spoke with a quiet fire I sometimes forgot he carried. "What good would it do?" I murmured. "They're not going to change. They'll still believe what they want to believe." Ethan's voice was calm, patient. "It's not about them, Mom. It's about you. So you don't forget what you've survived." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The seed was already planted. The next morning, I called the one man who had never once made me feel like I wasn't enough. Uncle Ben, my mother's older brother, a retired Navy mechanic with hands like tree roots and a heart bigger than the ocean. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Tell me the date, darlin'. I'll be there." We made our plans quietly, discreetly. No commercial flights, no social media posts. That was another life. In this one, I owned companies through shell names, moved investments behind layers of legal obscurity. I didn't need a spotlight to feel powerful. Power, I had learned, was best wielded unseen. Still, as the day approached, unease settled into my bones like a slow fog. Not fear. No, fear had been burned out of me long ago. It was something older, heavier. The gravity of walking back into a place that once broke me open. Late one night, when the packing was done and the house sat still, I found myself standing in Ethan's doorway, watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, the same as it had been when he was a baby. Soft breaths lifting and falling like tiny promises. I remembered every night I spent bent over bills I couldn't pay. Every shift I worked while he slept 2 doors down, unaware of the desperation that lined our nights. I remembered holding him during storms, both the kind outside and the ones inside me. I had built our life out of scraped knees and second chances, with hands that shook but never dropped him. And now, the very people who once dismissed me had invited me into their gilded halls, thinking I would come to be humiliated. They had no idea. I wasn't coming as the broken girl they left behind. I was coming as the storm they never saw brewing. The morning of the flight, Ethan appeared in the hallway wearing the navy blazer we'd picked out 2 weeks earlier, looking every bit like a young man stepping into his own story. He grinned when he saw me double-checking the travel bags. "You ready?" he asked, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. I smiled, slow, certain, born ready. And as we stepped into the waiting car, leaving the safe, familiar streets of London behind, I felt something old and sharp slip from my shoulders, like a coat I no longer needed to wear. Whatever waited for me on the other side of the Atlantic didn't matter. Not really. Because this time, I wasn't walking into their world seeking acceptance. This time, I was bringing my own. And no one, not David, not Madeline, not all the heart wealth combined, could take it from me again. The morning of our departure broke cold and gray, with the kind of overcast sky that felt more like an omen than an accident. I watched the mist roll off the Thames as I sipped my coffee, standing by the narrow window, the city blurred into a watercolor of grays and blues. Behind me, Ethan moved through the flat with an easy efficiency, double-checking the suitcases, counting passports. He had my knack for details, a trait I hadn't taught him so much as he had absorbed from years of watching me build our lives brick by unsteady brick. Our driver, a quiet man in a charcoal suit, arrived promptly at 7. I offered him a polite nod as he loaded our bags into the sleek black town car. No one in our neighborhood noticed our departure. They rarely did. I had built a life designed to slip between the cracks when necessary. The airport was another exercise in invisibility. We bypassed commercial terminals entirely, heading instead to a private hangar tucked at the far end of Heathrow. No paparazzi, no prying eyes, just a jet fueled and waiting, courtesy of one of the holding companies I technically didn't own. As we boarded, Uncle Ben was already seated inside, his thick arms crossed, his ball cap pulled low over his silver hair. He grinned when he saw us, that same lopsided smile that had comforted me since I was a little girl with scraped knees and bigger dreams than anyone thought sensible. "You clean up nice," he said, rising to pull me into a hug that smelled like motor oil and aftershave. "You still smell like a garage," I teased, and he laughed, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan dropped into the seat across from him, pulling a battered paperback out of his backpack. I sank into the leather seat beside them, exhaling slowly as the engines hummed to life. We took off into a sky as gray as ash, leaving London, and the version of myself I had been there behind. The flight passed in a kind of suspended silence. I spent the hours staring out the window at the endless Atlantic, remembering things I didn't want to remember. The first time I met David was at a downtown Savannah festival. He had smiled at me across a table stacked with hand-painted pottery, his blue eyes crinkling in the late summer sun. I'd fallen too fast, too deep, believing in the easy promises he made under the Spanish moss. I thought I was different, special. Instead, I became a cautionary tale whispered behind manicured hands. When I told him I was pregnant, he had said all the right things at first. Then the months dragged on, and the smiles grew tighter, the excuses longer, until one morning he simply wasn't there. No note, no goodbye, just absence, louder than any slam of a door. Madeline had been waiting in the wings, though I hadn't seen it then. Rich girls like her didn't need to fight, they just waited for the world to tilt in their favor. And now, years later, they had summoned me to the theater of their triumph, expecting me to play the fool. I clenched my hands together in my lap, feeling the slight tremble of old anger still humming beneath my skin. But anger was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had something better now. Purpose. As the plane began its descent into Savannah, I glanced at Ethan. He was asleep, his head tipped back against the seat, the book forgotten in his lap. There was a piece to his face that I would have crossed oceans to protect, and maybe that's exactly what I was doing. The private airstrip was little more than a wide stretch of tarmac lined with whispering pine trees. A black SUV idled at the edge, its driver holding a placard with a name that wasn't mine. It never would be. I traveled in shadows by choice, and today was no exception. The air outside hit me like a wet blanket, thick, warm, heavy with the scent of magnolia and old rain. It was a smell I remembered too well, a smell that had clung to every memory of heartbreak I had tried to leave behind. I inhaled deeply, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the car. As we drove, the familiar landscape of Georgia rolled past the windows. Fields stitched with wildflowers, drooping oaks wrapped in moss, iron gates guarding sprawling estates. It was beautiful, yes, but also false, in the way only old money could be. Savannah had never felt like home. It was a place that smiled at you while counting your flaws. Uncle Ben watched me carefully from the front seat, his expression unreadable. I could tell he wanted to say something, maybe even to warn me. But he didn't. He trusted me to know what I was doing, even if it terrified him. The road wound narrower, framed by towering hedges, until at last the Hart estate came into view. It was exactly as I remembered, obscene in its size, its grandeur designed not for comfort but for intimidation. White pillars rose like ancient sentinels, marble fountains sprayed arcs of crystal water, manicured lawns stretched toward the horizon like green oceans. I felt Ethan shift beside me, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I smiled at him, the kind of smile that had seen too many battles and survived them all. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm ready." The SUV pulled to a stop at the foot of a sweeping circular driveway, where uniformed valets moved with mechanical precision. A young man opened my door, offering a gloved hand I didn't take. I stepped out into the heavy Georgian air and stood for a moment, letting it press against my skin. Inside the house, I knew Madeline would be finalizing details, rehearsing how best to humiliate me without appearing crass. David would be sipping whiskey he didn't like, pretending he was a king in a kingdom that didn't belong to him. They thought they were ready for me. They had no idea what was coming. As I walked toward the front steps, my heels clicking sharply against the stone, I felt the weight of 1,000 memories pressing in from all sides. But I didn't flinch. I didn't falter. I wasn't here for revenge. I wasn't here for forgiveness. I was here to remind them that some women don't break. Some women become storms. And when the storm arrives, it doesn't knock politely at the door. It tears the whole damn house down. The front doors of the Hart estate loomed above me. Twin monoliths of dark wood carved with the kind of painstaking detail meant to announce old money without a word. A pair of staffers, young and stiff in matching uniforms, swung them open before I could touch the handle. Inside, the house smelled exactly the way I remembered, polish and lilies and something sharper underneath, like ambition soaked into the walls over generations. A woman with a clipboard and a headset approached, her smile brittle, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble. She didn't recognize me, of course. She saw only a name on a list, a face she couldn't quite place, a guess not important enough to fuss over. "Miss Evans," she chirped. "Welcome. Your suite is down the east corridor. Someone will escort your son and your guest as well." Uncle Ben lifted a brow at the word guest, but said nothing. Ethan kept his expression carefully neutral, a trick he had learned young, in a world that measured your worth before you even spoke. We followed a narrow young man in an ill-fitting suit through the hallways, past portraits of scowling ancestors and mahogany tables crowned with flower arrangements so large they looked vaguely hostile. Our suite was tucked away in a quieter wing of the house, the message clear even in the architecture. Close enough to attend, not close enough to matter. Perfect. As the door clicked shut behind us, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The room was lovely, of course. White linens, gleaming floors, a view of the back stables rather than the manicured gardens. I stood by the window for a long moment, watching a pair of horses being led across the paddock, their coats gleaming in the heavy afternoon light. Ethan tossed his bag onto the bed and flopped down beside it, his legs hanging over the edge. "It's nice," he said, voice casual, but I could hear the edge beneath it. The calculation, the awareness. "They don't want us too close," he added. "That's fine," I said, smoothing the creases from my slacks. "I didn't come here to be close," he grinned. "Good." I pulled the emerald dress from the garment bag and hung it carefully on the wardrobe. Tomorrow. That was for tomorrow. Today was for reconnaissance, for seeing how the pieces moved across the board before the game began in earnest. We spent the afternoon walking the grounds, Ethan and I, blending in with the handful of early guests who drifted from the main house to the white reception tent being erected on the lawn. The tent was enormous, its ceiling draped in white chiffon and twinkling fairy lights, as if someone had tried to bottle starlight and hang it from the rafters. Tables dressed in cream and gold lined the space, each centerpiece a small, living jungle of roses, orchids, and eucalyptus. At the far end, the altar had been erected, a marble platform framed by two towering columns wrapped in ivy and soft white blooms. A stage set for a coronation, not a union. I watched from the sidelines, noting the careful choreography of the staff, the way guests were sorted with casual cruelty, the ones seated near the front with names that echoed across generations, the others nudged toward the back with the polite indifference reserved for necessary afterthoughts. "Who's that?" Ethan asked, nodding toward a woman in a lavender-sheathed dress, clipboard in hand, her mouth a tight slash of disapproval as she directed the florists. "Madeline's mother," I said softly. "Loretta Hart." He studied her with open curiosity, the way one might observe a snake behind glass. "She looks like she bites." I smiled despite myself, only when cornered. We didn't linger long. I didn't want to draw attention yet, not until the time was right. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised violets and molten gold, we returned to the guest wing. Uncle Ben was already there, seated on the small balcony off the sitting room, nursing a glass of iced tea and watching the horizon like an old sentry. "Everything's shaping up real fancy out there," he said without looking at me. "Shame it's all built on rot." "That's how it usually is," I murmured, sinking into the chair beside him. He glanced over, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his cap. "You sure you're ready for this, kid?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not the one who needs to be worried." He grunted, satisfied, and turned his attention back to the gathering dusk. That night, as Savannah exhaled into a velvet darkness heavy with the scent of blooming night jasmine, I sat at the small writing desk in the corner of our suite. My laptop glowed quietly in the shadows, a silent witness to the life I had built far away from this place. I reviewed contracts, answered emails, signed off on 2 investment proposals, mundane, methodical acts that reminded me who I was now. Not a girl abandoned with nothing but a baby and a broken heart. Not a pariah shuffled to the margins. I was a builder, a survivor, a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. Ethan slept soundly in the next room, his breathing even, his presence a quiet balm against the rising tide of memory. Somewhere in the main house, laughter floated through the halls, sharp and brittle as spun sugar. The rehearsal dinner, no doubt, toasts and champagne, and the careful performance of happiness. I could imagine David there, nursing a glass of whiskey, laughing too loudly at the right jokes. I could imagine Madeline on his arm, radiant and polished, her smile sharpened to a weapon. And I could imagine them exchanging glances when they spoke of me, the ghost they had invited into their celebration, certain she would play her part quietly, decorously, humiliated by proximity to their triumph. I closed my laptop with a soft click and leaned back, stretching my arms above my head. Let them have their laughter tonight. Tomorrow, the real show would begin. And when it did, They would learn something they should have known all along. Not every ghost is content to haunt the margins. Some walk straight into the light and tear the whole page apart. Morning came heavy and slow, the kind of humid, clinging heat that made the air feel almost solid. From the window of our suite, the estate looked surreal, a place too carefully composed to be real, too polished to breathe naturally. The white reception tent shimmered in the distance, its fabric walls billowing faintly like a living thing. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a soft, sleeveless blouse in deep navy and a pair of tailored slacks. No emerald dress yet. That would come later. Right now, I needed to move unnoticed, a shadow slipping through the cracks before the storm broke loose. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as I fastened a simple gold bracelet around my wrist, a gift from my mother, long before the world taught me how easily love could be discarded. "You sure about today?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes serious. I smiled. "I've been sure since the moment that envelope landed on our table." He nodded once, the way a soldier might before marching into battle, and together we stepped into the hallways that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old pride. The estate had been transformed overnight. Chandeliers blazed from the high ceilings. Floral arrangements the size of small trees crowded the corridors. Staffers moved briskly with clipboards and radios, their faces tight with purpose. Outside, beyond the wide veranda, guests were beginning to arrive in glossy black town cars, emerging like actors stepping onto a carefully lit stage. We moved through them, polite but detached, just another pair of names on a long guest list. I caught sight of David first. He stood near the entrance to the tent, one hand shoved casually into the pocket of his tailored trousers, a glass of something amber in the other. He laughed at something one of his groomsmen said, the sound bright but brittle, like a glass stretched too thin. It hit me then, sharp and sudden, how little he had changed. 11 years, and he still carried himself like a boy playing at being a man. The tuxedo, the polished smile, the easy stance. It was all armor, and like most armor worn too long, it had started to crack. He didn't see me. Not yet. I let my gaze drift past him to Madeline, who stood radiant near the altar, giving last-minute instructions to the photographer, her every movement choreographed to project effortless perfection. She wore a pre-wedding gown, something sleek and ivory, cinched at the waist and flowing to the ground in careful, curated elegance. Her hair was arranged in a halo of soft blonde waves, her smile sharp enough to cut. When her eyes flicked over the crowd and landed on me, I saw it. The flicker of surprise, quickly smothered. She had expected me to come, but not like this. Not standing straight-backed and unafraid, not with Ethan at my side, tall and steady as a lighthouse against the tide. She turned back to her conversation without acknowledgement. But it was too late. I had seen it. The tiny crack in her composure. We found our seats near the back of the tent, as expected. Far from the family, far from the friends who mattered. I didn't mind. From here I could see everything. The altar, the guests' expressions shifting like cards being reshuffled at a rigged table. The air inside the tent was heavy with perfume and pretense. Conversations buzzed like insects trapped under glass, brittle and buzzing, sweet with falseness. Ethan leaned close. "They're trying so hard to make it look easy," he murmured. I smiled without looking away. That's always the way with people who have everything to prove. The ceremony began with a flourish of strings, a quartet tucked into the corner, bowing their instruments with mechanical grace. People rose as Madeline made her entrance, her veil trailing like mist, her smile radiant as she floated down the aisle on her father's arm. The murmur of admiration rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. I remained seated a moment longer than the others, watching, assessing. Then, slowly, I rose too. Not because the moment demanded it, but because I chose to. Madeline's gaze flicked briefly toward the back of the tent, as if checking to see if the bait had worked, if I had shown up just to be diminished. I met her eyes calmly. And I smiled. The ceremony itself was a blur of soft vows and glistening tears, all carefully curated to perfection. They spoke of destiny and forever and second chances, the words so smooth they might have been read from a teleprompter. When David spoke, his voice wavered once, just once, when he said, "For better or worse," and for a heartbeat, he looked past Madeline, past the altar. To me, it lasted only a moment, but it was enough. The vows ended, rings exchanged, a kiss, brief and staged, sealed the performance. Polite applause fluttered through the tent like the beat of tired wings. The real show, I knew, was yet to come. As guests flowed from the tent toward the massive open-air reception area, a wonderland of gold and glass and carefully arranged splendor, I kept to the edges, watching. Madeline moved through the crowd like a queen anointed, greeting guests with kisses and laughter, accepting congratulations with practiced humility. David followed, always a step behind, smiling that same hollow smile that had once convinced me of things he never meant to keep. The reception sparkled, champagne flowed like a river, a band played old standards polished to a high shine. It would have been easy to believe in the fantasy they had built here, to fall under its spell. If you didn't know where to look, if you didn't know how to see the hairline fractures running beneath the surface, waiting for the right pressure to split them open. I felt Ethan's hand brush against mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't the girl they had abandoned anymore. And as Madeline's gaze swept across the room again, lingering a fraction too long on me, I smiled to myself. She thought she was still in control. She thought this was still her game. But storms don't play by the rules. They change the game altogether. The reception unfolded like a pageant, each movement carefully choreographed, each laugh rehearsed to sound effortless. Crystal glasses clinked in the soft light of chandeliers strung across the open air, while waiters in crisp uniforms weaved through the crowd with silver trays balanced on steady hands. I remained near the edges, a ghost among the glittering, a witness to the performance. Madeline moved like she owned the world. She floated from guest to guest, her voice bright and brittle, her hand lingering a touch too long on arms and shoulders. Every moment was a display, a broadcast to everyone watching. Look what I have. Look what I won. David stayed close, but his smile frayed at the edges more with every passing toast. There was something in his stance, a subtle stiffness, a tightening of the mouth, that spoke to a man performing in a play he no longer believed in. Ethan and I found a small table tucked into a corner. He sat tall in his chair, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. Beside him, I let my fingers trail along the rim of my untouched champagne glass, feeling the fine vibration of the evening building toward something inevitable. I didn't have to wait long. Madeline spotted me. Finally, she made her approach slowly, deliberately, as if giving the room time to notice. Her train trailed behind her like a banner. The smile on her lips was all sweetness and sharpened steel. "Clara," she cooed, her voice carrying just loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. "I'm so glad you could come. I wasn't sure if the invitation would reach wherever it is you live these days." I rose smoothly before she could loom over me. I would not let her take that ground. "Some messages," I said lightly, "have a way of finding you, no matter how far you've traveled." Her gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, who rose beside me, tall and composed. "And you brought company," she said, the tiniest edge of confusion coloring her tone. I smiled, easy and calm. "This is my son, Ethan." The moment stretched. Madeline's eyes darted to Ethan's features. Too much of David there to be ignored. She recovered quickly, schooling her face back into its practiced serenity. "Of course," she said with an airy wave of her hand. "We all carry reminders of the past, don't we?" "Some reminders," I said, meeting her gaze steadily, "grow into reasons for the future." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Without another word, she swept away, her veil catching slightly on the corner of a chair. A small, almost invisible stumble. But I saw it, and so did Ethan. He leaned toward me as she disappeared into the crowd. "She didn't expect you to still have your spine," he said quietly. "No," I murmured. "She didn't expect me to have built wings." We sat back down watching the evening unfold. Toasts began soon after, the usual parade of sycophants praising love and destiny and fate's benevolent hand. I barely listened, my mind already humming with the electricity of what was coming. And then it happened. A slight ripple at the far end of the tent, so small most missed it. A waitress stepped forward, a tray still balanced in her hand, her dark eyes locked on the head table. She moved carefully, deliberately, threading through the crowd like a swimmer slicing through water. I recognized her at once. Naomi. 2 years ago, I had found her sitting outside a job center in the rain, shivering, half-starved and furious with the world that had discarded her. I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't need her confession. I simply handed her a card and told her she wasn't done yet. Now, here she was. A force. A reckoning. She stopped a few feet from the head table, every eye slowly turning toward her as the energy shifted, subtle but undeniable. Naomi cleared her throat, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough to silence the chatter. "I have something to say." The room froze, forks poised midair, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the band stumbled into silence. Madeline's smile faltered. David set his glass down too quickly, the clink unnaturally loud in the hush. Naomi turned slightly, so the whole room could see her. "That woman," she said, lifting a hand to point directly toward me, "is Clara Evans. Some of you probably know her as the ex, the one left behind, the one you were invited to laugh at tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, curious, hungry. "But that's not who she is," Naomi continued, her voice rising with righteous fury. "Not anymore. Not ever, really." She paused, letting the words sink into the stunned silence. "I met Clara 2 years ago. I was homeless. Alone. I thought my life was over, and she found me. She helped me, gave me work, paid for my classes, made sure I had a roof over my head, and she didn't do it for credit. She didn't do it for recognition." Naomi's voice broke slightly, but she pushed forward, her hand trembling just a little. "And she's done that for dozens of women. Built something powerful and real while the rest of you polished your illusions." Across the room, I saw Loretta Hart stiffen, her mouth flattening into a grim line. Naomi wasn't finished. "And if you think she's still some discarded footnote," she said, turning to face Madeline now, "maybe you should ask yourselves, who really holds the power here?" She dropped the tray onto a nearby table with a clatter that sounded like thunder. And then, with the calm of someone who had just set a bomb and walked away, she strode back into the crowd, leaving the room crackling with disbelief. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, a few hands began to clap. Scattered applause at first, then a swelling tide, a sound that filled the tent like the roll of distant drums. Not forced, not polite, real. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of 1,000 old wounds lift from my shoulders as I stood. Ethan rose beside me, his hand finding mine, steady and sure. Across the room, David stared at me, his face ashen. Madeline's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white against the gleaming tablecloth. And as I stepped forward, walking through the tide of rising applause, I knew something with absolute certainty. They had invited me here to witness their triumph. Instead, they had handed me the stage, and I would not waste it. The applause faded slowly, like the last tremor of a distant thunderstorm, leaving behind a charged silence that buzzed against my skin. I didn't rush. I let the stillness stretch, let the weight of it settle over every table, every perfectly curated bouquet, every false smile. When I reached the center of the room, I turned and faced them all. The families, the polished guests, the strangers who had once been eager to believe in my ruin. I lifted my chin, my voice steady and low, but it carried effortlessly through the heavy air. "I didn't come here to disrupt your day," I said, my gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I came because I was invited, because once, a long time ago, I believed that forgiveness meant disappearing, staying small, staying silent." Across the tent, Madeline sat frozen, her champagne flute untouched before her. David stared at me with something between shame and disbelief. "But I'm not here to be small anymore," I continued. "And I'm not here to be anyone's ghost." My eyes locked on Madeline's for a heartbeat. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. "I survived," I said simply, "and I thrived. Not because anyone made it easy for me, but because I decided I was worth the fight." There was a ripple through the room, a soft shifting, like people straightening unconsciously in their seats. I let them have the silence again. Sometimes silence said more than any speech ever could. Then I turned, finding Ethan where he stood at the edge of the tent, tall and unwavering. His eyes met mine, steady and sure, and for a moment it was just the two of us. A thread spun across a chasm too deep for anyone else to cross. I reached for his hand. He came to me without hesitation, and we turned our backs on them all. We were halfway to the tent's edge when Madeline's voice broke through, shrill and trembling under the weight of everything she had just lost. "You can't just walk away," she snapped. "You can't ruin everything because you're still bitter." I stopped, turned slowly. Ethan's grip tightened around mine. I met her furious, panicked eyes without flinching. "If your marriage," I said quietly, "can be ruined by the truth, maybe it wasn't built on anything real to begin with." The words landed hard. I saw it in the way her mouth opened and closed, searching for a retort that didn't exist. And then David stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. He rose like a man finally dragged to the surface after years underwater, blinking against the light he had spent too long avoiding. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, "I never meant for any of this to happen." The entire tent seemed to lean forward, the breath held tight in 1,000 lungs. I tilted my head slightly, almost curious. "Which part?" I asked. "Walking away from me? From your son? Pretending we didn't exist?" David flinched like I'd struck him. His hands opened and closed uselessly at his sides. "I thought," he began, then faltered. "I thought I was protecting you." It wasn't anger that filled me then. It was something colder, cleaner, a final, cutting clarity. "No," I said. "You were protecting yourself." The words hung there between us, undeniable. And then Ethan stepped forward. The boy who had grown up watching the door, wondering if it would ever open. The boy who had learned to build walls where fathers should have stood. He faced David without fear. "Do you even know what day I was born?" Ethan asked, his voice clear and unwavering. David opened his mouth, closed it. The silence was louder than any confession. "I used to tell myself you were dead," Ethan said, his voice soft but sharp, "because it was easier than believing you just didn't care." Madeline looked away then, her hands twisting in her lap. Loretta Hart, seated a few rows back, stared stonily at the tablecloth. "I sent you letters," Ethan continued. "I asked about you. I used to ask Mom if you were ever coming back." His voice cracked, just once. He didn't hide it. "And when I stopped asking," he said, "it wasn't because I forgot. It was because I gave up." David sagged, like someone had cut the strings that held him upright. The entire room was silent. No orchestra. No whispered gossip. Just the raw, ringing truth of a boy finally done carrying the weight someone else abandoned. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, and then with a breath that sounded almost like a release, he said, "I forgive you." The words weren't shouted. They weren't triumphant. They were simple, heavy, final. "But not for you," Ethan added, "for me." David made a broken sound low in his throat, but Ethan had already turned back to me, his shoulders straighter, his face lighter somehow. He smiled, a real smile, small but brilliant, and pointed to me. "She made me who I am," he said. "She made me strong." I felt something deep inside me settle, finally, into place. A foundation laid stone by painful stone over years of silent work. There was no applause, no cinematic swelling of music, only the quiet, enduring truth that some victories don't need witnesses to be real. Madeline stood then, knocking her chair askew. Her face had lost its lacquered perfection, and the desperation that flickered across her features was raw, unpolished, human. "So what now?" she demanded, her voice brittle. "You just walk away?" I met her gaze, steady and calm. "No," I said. "We walk forward. You're the one who's stuck." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. And without another glance back, Ethan and I turned and left the tent behind, stepping into the cool, waiting twilight. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes. The stars began to press their silver fingerprints against the velvet sky. Behind us, the illusion crumbled, its shattered pieces too sharp for anyone left inside to ignore. Ahead of us stretched the road home. Not the place we had come from, the place we had built, together. The night was deep by the time we returned to our suite, the heavy velvet of the Georgia sky stitched with only a few cautious stars. Ethan sat quietly on the edge of the bed, unlacing his shoes, his face contemplative but calm. I moved through the motions of packing without really seeing what I was doing. Each neatly folded shirt, each zipped suitcase was a piece of armor, a preparation for the last step. Because there was still one conversation left to have. One door that needed to be closed from my side, permanently. I glanced over at Ethan, who was watching me with quiet understanding. "You don't have to go," he said. I smiled faintly. "Yes, I do." He didn't argue. He just nodded, the way only someone who truly knew you would. I changed quickly, trading the navy slacks for sharp black trousers and a simple cream blouse. No jewelry, no perfume. Just the steady hum of purpose thrumming through my blood. Uncle Ben was waiting by the car, arms folded across his chest, the engine idling low like a heartbeat. He didn't ask where I was going. He just handed me a set of keys and said, "I'll be right here when you're done." The Hart estate had quieted, the aftershocks of the night still rippling unseen through its halls. Staff moved in subdued silence, clearing half-eaten plates and discarded glasses, stepping around fallen napkins and shattered illusions. I walked the side corridors, my heels muted against the polished wood, until I reached the old wing, the place they kept the real power hidden behind oil portraits and oak-paneled doors. Lark Hart's office, the woman behind the stage, the architect of appearances. The door was ajar. She was waiting for me. Lark Hart sat behind a wide mahogany desk, a fountain pen poised elegantly in her hand as she reviewed a thick stack of documents. Her silver hair was coiled into a perfect knot at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place. Her navy suit was sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't look up when I entered. She didn't need to. "I was wondering if you'd show up," she said, her voice crisp and cold as the crystal decanter sitting untouched by her elbow. "You expected something," I replied, stepping inside and closing the door with a quiet click behind me. "You just didn't know what?" Lark lifted her gaze then, sharp blue eyes meeting mine across the room. "You've caused quite the mess tonight," she said. "No," I said evenly. "I just pointed out the cracks you spent years pretending weren't there." For a moment we simply stared at each other, two women separated by age, wealth, and history, but not by will. In that we were equals. "What do you want, Miss Evans?" Lark asked finally, her fingers drumming softly against the wood. "Revenge? Money? A public apology?" I laughed once, low and humorless. "If I wanted revenge, you'd already be ruined." She flinched almost imperceptibly, and that was when I knew. The woman who had once looked at me like dirt under her polished shoes was afraid. "I want the truth corrected," I said calmly. "Every document, every record you manipulated to erase me and my son from the narrative. I want it made right." "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice still mild, but the edge beneath it unmistakable. I leaned forward slightly, placing my hands flat on her desk, letting her see exactly how serious I was. "You won't," I said, "because you know better than anyone how fast a house of cards collapses when someone starts pulling at the base." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your charity foundations," I said quietly, "your hidden investments, your carefully laundered family assets. I've been patient. I've stayed silent. But I won't stay invisible anymore." The color drained slightly from her face. "You've built your legacy on the illusion of control," I said, my voice softening almost into pity. "But illusions are fragile things." Silence stretched long and taut between us. Finally, she spoke, her words clipped and bitter. "You think you can destroy us with whispers?" "No," I said. "You already destroyed yourselves. I'm just turning on the lights." Lark stared at me for a long moment, the weight of years and decisions and buried skeletons pressing down between us. Then, slowly, she picked up a heavy leather portfolio from the corner of her desk and slid it across to me. Inside I knew would be the beginning. The records, the corrections, the first bricks torn out of the wall they had tried to build around me. I didn't thank her. This wasn't a favor. This was a reckoning. As I turned to leave, my hand on the door, she called out softly, almost like a ghost. "You could have had it easier, if you'd just stayed quiet. If you'd just stayed small." I looked back at her, feeling nothing but a deep, bone-deep certainty. "I was never meant to stay small," I said. "You just couldn't see it." And I walked away, the leather folder tucked under my arm, the night wrapping around me like a second skin. Outside, Uncle Ben stood leaning against the car, his arms crossed, watching the darkened windows with a patience honed from a lifetime of waiting out storms. When he saw me, he pushed off the hood and opened the door without a word. I slid into the passenger seat, feeling lighter, sharper, freer than I had in years. As we pulled away from the estate, leaving its crumbling facades and polished lies behind, I rested my head against the window and let the cool glass steady my racing heart. The road unwound before us, dark and silent, but for the first time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. A real one. Beside me, Uncle Ben reached over and gave my hand a brief, firm squeeze, saying nothing but saying everything all at once. And in the back seat, the folder lay quietly, a small, tangible proof that sometimes the past doesn't get to write your ending. Sometimes you pick up the pen yourself, and you start a brand new chapter. The flight back to London was quiet, not heavy, not weighted like the trip over had been. This time, the silence was something softer, a kind of peace that settled between Ethan and me like a worn blanket on a cold night. He dozed beside me, a paperback folded loosely in his lap, his face turned toward the window, where endless clouds rolled like soft hills under a pale sky. I watched him for a long time, marveling at the simple, profound fact of him, of us. We had come through the fire, and we hadn't just survived. We had been tempered. The city greeted us with a thin drizzle and the familiar gray stretch of stone and glass. Our little flat felt smaller somehow when we returned, but not in a bad way. Cozy, solid, ours. I unpacked slowly, setting the folder from the Hart estate onto the kitchen counter like an artifact. I'd deal with it in time. The paperwork, the official corrections, the slow dismantling of the lies that had once buried us, it would all be handled. But not tonight. Tonight was for something else. I made dinner, simple and warm. Pasta with fresh herbs, garlic bread from the bakery down the street. Ethan ate with the easy appetite of a boy unburdened, talking about school, about a podcast episode he wanted to record, about how he thought maybe he wanted to study political science someday. I listened, smiling, the sound of his voice filling every crack in my soul that had once ached hollow. Later, when the dishes were done and the house was still, I sat at my desk by the window and opened my laptop. The blank page stared back at me, bright and endless. I placed my hands on the keyboard, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then began to type. Not about them. Not about the Harts or Madeline or David. Not about betrayal. Not about survival. About beginning. About the fierce, stubborn miracle of choosing to write your own story when the world tried to erase it. The words came slower than I expected at first, halting, uncertain, but they came. And with every line, the old ghosts grew quieter. I wasn't writing for vengeance. I wasn't writing to prove anything. I was writing because I could, because I was still here, still standing, and I wanted women like me, the ones who had been left behind, the ones who had been told they weren't enough, to know they could stand too. When I finally closed the laptop hours later, my hands ached, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. Across the hall, Ethan's door was ajar. I peeked inside and found him sprawled across his bed, one arm thrown over his eyes, everything deep and even. I smiled and closed the door softly behind me. The days that followed moved quickly. The documents from the Hart family arrived by courier, acknowledgments, corrected legal records, financial reconciliations. I forwarded them to my lawyer with a simple note: finalize and file. There would be no press releases, no public spectacle. Real power doesn't need an audience. Meanwhile, Ethan's podcast grew. Fatherless Not Voiceless found its listeners. Teenagers, single mothers, even grown men who wrote in quietly, admitting that the holes left in them by absent fathers still ached. He handled it all with a grace that astonished me. Careful, honest, fierce when he needed to be. And I kept writing. The blog turned into a small community. The community turned into a movement. We called it The Second Thread. A place for women to find each other, to stitch new lives out of the remnants of old pain. Workshops, support groups, legal advice, career mentorships. Not a charity, not a handout, a lifeline. Sometimes the letters made me cry, sometimes they made me furious, but mostly they made me grateful. Because every story they shared, every scar they showed, proved the same thing. We were never broken, we were forged. One night, about 6 months after the wedding that wasn't ours to mourn, a small package arrived by mail. Brown paper, no return address. Inside was a book, my book, the first copy sent from the publisher. The cover was simple, white background, a single golden thread unraveling into light. The title printed in firm, quiet serif font, What They Tried to Bury. And underneath, my name. Not hidden, not whispered. Clara Evans. I stood there in the middle of our kitchen, the book heavy in my hands, feeling the ground beneath me shift again, not violently this time, but steadily, like something long buried finally rising to meet the sun. Ethan appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is that it?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. He came closer, peering at the cover, then at me. "You proud?" he asked. I swallowed hard and smiled. "I'm whole." He grinned and wrapped his arms around me, hugging me tight enough to lift me off the ground for just a second. And somewhere between the laughter and the tears that rose sharp and sudden in my throat, I realized something. The fight was never about being seen by them. It was about seeing myself, the girl who refused to disappear, the woman who refused to be rewritten, the mother who refused to let abandonment define her child. We had rewritten the story, Ethan and I, not with grand gestures or sweeping revenge, but with every small, stubborn choice to keep moving forward. And we weren't finished, not by a long shot. A month later, I stood on a stage in a small community center in Dublin, speaking to a room full of women, teachers, nurses, single moms, survivors, all of them carrying invisible battles under their skin. I told them the truth, that healing doesn't come in a single lightning bolt moment. It comes in the slow, steady stitching of your soul back together, thread by stubborn thread. When I finished, the applause was quiet at first, almost shy. Then it grew, and for the first time in my life, I accepted it. Not because I needed their approval, but because I had finally stopped needing permission to believe in myself. And when I stepped off that stage, Ethan was there, waiting for me. His hand steady and warm in mine. The storm had come and gone, and we were still standing, still writing, still building the future one choice at a time. And this time, it was ours. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this story. It means more than words can express. If there's one thing I hope you take away from Clara's journey, it's this. Life may try to bury you, but it can never erase your worth unless you let it. You are stronger than the storms you've survived. You are not defined by the ones who left, but by the battles you fought and won to still be standing today. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. It always amazes me how far these stories can travel and connect us across the miles. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that healing and hope are always possible, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have so many more powerful stories coming, stories of resilience, hope, and the quiet strength that changes everything. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in new beginnings. And most of all, thank you for being part of this journey.